Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL round number 4 overview and analysis video here in the summer split playoffs. We are really getting down to the nitty-gritty now. We have eliminated basically everybody. We have 4 teams left standing in the LPL to determine who will be our summer split champions, who will be going to Worlds alongside them with the most championship points, and it's the top 4 seeds from the regular season. No surprises to get here, but now that we've reached the double elimination stage of the bracket, there certainly is a lot of opportunity for teams to start stepping up where they maybe haven't before. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. Check out the round 3 video up in the iCard right now if you are interested. Of course, at the end of that, we do quickly preview round number 4, but since that video came out at a weird time with some technical issues, I didn't actually preview the first series as it was happening as I was recording. Of course, I didn't see it at the time. Still definitely talked at least a little bit about it, but there is definitely a lot to preview when it comes to the expectations for the series that we'll get into here, but if you want to know my thoughts on everything that has happened in the LPL playoffs up until this point, you can check out the playlist that's up there as well. So if either of those videos interest you, go ahead and check them out. But today, we're going to be covering round number 4, our first upper bracket series, technically, of the entire tournament. So let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, at the end of the video, we will quickly go over the bracket, talk about the upcoming series, both winners, finals, and the lower bracket round number 4 series. We will preview what you can expect from that and how those teams match up against each other, but most of today will be spent talking about the upper bracket round 4 series that we got this past weekend. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Our first matchup is one of the more interesting ones we could possibly get. I think these two teams are kind of parallels of each other in a lot of interesting ways, at least organizationally. It's the number 1 seeded Bilibili Gaming taking on the number 4 seeded Weibo Gaming. I say that they are parallels in an interesting way because to me, these are two orgs that have both tried to do the same thing over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, and they both had varying success, and both are kind of hitting their stride right now. Weibo Gaming, obviously, kind of quote-unquote a new org in the LPL, but really they were born out of Suning, and so I'm going to consider them, you know, kind of the lineage of Suning, and they make the World Finals in 2020. That's a pretty big thing. But really outside of that, you know, leading into last year, they've not really been able to replicate that level of success. They have continuously put a lot of money and resources into trying to bring big names to the organization. And up until 2024, or 2023, I should say, they really weren't finding any sort of success. And even last year, they were really struggling quite a bit for a majority of the year. Bilibili kind of in a similar boat. This is a team that historically, notoriously, was going super team after super team, trying to build something, whether it was around Meteor, whether it was around Fofo, whether it was bringing Uzi out of retirement. Like, they had thrown everything at the wall to try and see what could stick to get them not only to Worlds, but to be a Worlds contender, and nothing really actually latched on up until 2023, where both of these teams' fortunes ended up turning around. Of course, BLG going to MSI finals, going to those semifinals of Worlds, being in the finals of the LPL, a lot of really big things, and of course, winning their first trophy in the spring split. That was massive. They go back to MSI finals this year. There is a lot of good happening for Bilibili, the golden era of this organization around, you know, Bin and Elk and On as kind of the core, if you will. And then Weibo Gaming goes to Worlds Finals last year. Yes, they had some inconsistencies, but the fact that they got there at all is a really big testament to this org. So two notorious organizations that have both over and underperformed at different times throughout their history, now facing off against each other. Playstyle-wise, I think they match up very intriguingly. Bilibili has done a complete swap in terms of what their playstyle is. If you remember Bilibili from last split or from last year, don't take that into account here. With Wei coming in as the new jungler over Shun, they play almost entirely differently. They have slowed down considerably. They are not nearly as aggressive in the early game. They play a lot more controlled tempo style of game. They play for objectives, you know, that kind of game plan. That's certainly what Wei is more comfortable on, and it does seem to have fit Bilibili. Not that they can't play super aggressive, but players like Elk and On, I think, were having to do so much in terms of their wins at the beginning part of the split in the 2v2 in the bot lane, and now because we're in a meta where scaling is a little bit easier to get off with the AD carries in the mid lane with, things like Maokai or Brand or, Zyra in the jungle, you all of a sudden have more options if you are able to stall out the game and if you feel more confident in your plays in the later half of the game. So for Bilibili, it's definitely been something that's increased their floor. I'm not sure if it's going to limit their ceiling. That's only something that we will see as we continue to move along. That was kind of my thought process on bringing Wei in, is higher floor, lower ceiling types of games out of Bilibili, but we haven't seen them play in the playoffs yet. We'll see if that even really translates. And then for Weibo Gaming on the other side, this is one of the more aggressive teams in the early game. This is the Weibo Gaming that we came to know and love last year, and it's very funny because the team looks almost entirely different. Now, instead of doing it around the Shy and around Weiwei, it's around Tarzan, who is the most aggressive early game jungler in the region, and it's not particularly close. And the thing that lets him get away with it is his champion pool, where he likes to play things like Sejuani and really just skirmish a lot early. If he can get his laners ahead, the game is generally over. But the adaptation from Weibo has been playing around Tarzan rather than using Tarzan to try to play around like Xiaohu or Light or Bree. That's what's really allowed this team to kind of shed their bad form at the beginning of the year and really grow into the team that they are in right now, is really just trusting their jungler that they picked up to be the star that they know he can be. Of course, they're going to be pretty big underdogs here. Bilibili is at the current time the best team in the LPL. They're defending champions and, the number one seed. They've got everything going for them going into this series, and so of course they're going to be considered favorites. I had them picked as my LPL champions coming out of this split, but Weibo certainly good enough to at least push them. I just would be a bit surprised if they walked out of this series with a win, but the only way to find out how that ends up going is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was your typical BLG performance, at least from the second half of the split. Not a super aggressive game, not one where they're attempting to make all of these crazy aggressive skirmishes in the early game. They're just trying to get to the part of the game they feel most comfortable in, and that's the mid to late game, and that's exactly what happened for BLG. They end up picking up the Ziggs on B4 in the draft, and that's really influential in the early game. We see them really prioritizing trying to get towers and objectives early on in the game just to set up for the Maokai and the Corki to be able to carry later on in the game, and that's exactly what happens. Elk does a great job of establishing pressure on the bot side, and they're able to translate that into getting Wei and Knight on the map, around the map. These 5v5s end up being super easy for them to win because they're getting picks left and right. They're waiting for Weibo to make mistakes, and they're going to make mistakes. And so just a clean, calm, collected game from BLG. For Weibo Gaming, they were definitely taken off kilter. I think if the series continues to slow down, they're going to have a lot of trouble because this is not a team that really functions well in slow-paced environments. One of the things that really was burning them at the beginning of the split, when they were really struggling in the group stage in Group D, was the fact that they were trying to play a little bit slower, that Tarzan is trying to, he's a player that's more notorious for being a little bit slower, a little bit more objective-focused, kind of similar to Wei in that regard, but it wasn't really working out for this team because the rest of this team really couldn't play that style. The moment that they started to speed up, things just got better. But if Bilibili is going to slow down the pace once again, that could be a really big detriment to Weibo Gaming, so we'll have to see that. But player of the game for me is going to go to Knight. I think you could give this to quite a few people. Wei had a really good game on the Maokai, obviously got that Baron steal that essentially ended up ending the game. You have Elk, who basically ran all of the early game. The laning on the Ziggs was unbelievable. They were just moving him around into every single lane to take towers left and right and to establish a gold lead for BLG that they could then use to translate into objective control. Like, if you wanted to give it to either of those two, I completely understand, but Knight really was the one who popped off. He got a solo kill on Xiaohu in a side lane, basically in a 1v4. Pretty impressive stuff from him on the Corki, and then obviously took over every single 5v5. The moment that Wei stole that Baron at the end of the game, Knight goes in. He's able to pick up like 2, 3, 4 kills in that 5v5 and just end up snowballing the game out of control. Knight is incredible. I think his style of play has actually been enhanced quite a bit by bringing Wei in. Because Wei is so controlled, it allows Knight to be super aggressive on the map, and it allows him, especially in the late game, to kind of play hero ball, which is something he's really freaking good at. Like, Elk was asked to do that so much at the beginning of the split, just purely based on where the meta was. We were seeing a lot of, scaling junglers, and so you're asking Elk and On to win the 2v2 a lot more consistently. That's not necessary as much anymore. You can draft something like a Ziggs on the bottom side of the map and say, like, we can play for late game and we can play for a front to back that Knight can just take over and win. And obviously he's going to be able to do that. He's the best player in the LPL. I don't even think it's really all all that controversial to say that anymore. I've been saying it for like 4 years on this channel or something. At some point, we just have to completely agree that that is just the case. Knight is the best player in the LPL, and he continues to show it. I will say Ben was there along for the ride. On was along for the ride. They didn't really have to do a whole ton. A couple of really nice engages, especially at the end of the game for the Rel, but this was Wei, this was Knight, and this was Elk really being the focal points of where BLG wanted to put their pressure through. And then for Weibo on the other side, again, they just didn't really have the firepower to be able to play BLG's game and actually still be able to win. Xiaohu is a very easy choice, in my opinion, for dud of the game. Nothing on the Zeri. You were literally getting no output out of him on that champion. There was just nothing he was actually capable of doing throughout this game, constantly getting caught out in a side lane, constantly being in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting caught out first in team fights. It's just not good. We were actually praising his Zeri mechanics in the previous series against Ninjas in Pajamas because they were very good, the mechanics at the very least. And I still think that mechanically he's a very good Zeri player, but the problem is that mentally he makes so many macro mistakes and he's in the wrong place at the wrong time that it really just puts such a huge target on his back, and it makes it very difficult for Weibo to actually be able to play around him as a carry. And look at this draft. Like, it is entirely predicated on Zeri getting ahead. You really don't have anyone else in these matchups that actually is able to do anything. So Xiaohu being really bad in this game was a really big problem for Weibo Gaming, and to me, it was a very clear dud of the game. I didn't really have to think about this at all. Breathe also could have been better. He was actually pretty good in the laning phase. We've seen Gragas actually be pretty successful in the 1v1 specifically into something like Renekton, but there just was absolutely nothing there the later the game went. Tarzan got completely out-jungled. Again, the more the pace slows down, I think the more Weibo struggles with what they want to do in the mid-game. They just don't really have a lot of tempo in that regard. Light and Crisp were along for the ride. I really am not blaming either of them. I think this was mostly Xiaohu just getting absolutely obliterated in the mid lane 1v1 and then getting caught out in side lanes and not really having any damage or pressure. There was no way they were ever going to win any of these late game team fights without a Zeri. And so you just have to chalk this one up to hopefully Xiaohu is better moving into game number 2. But if that's the hope, there's going to be some concerns. He's going into the best mid laner in the LPL, one of the best players in the entire world. And you're asking him to not only just be neutral, but be as good as the other player, and that's just hard to do. And so we'll see what happens for Weibo, but this is not a very encouraging game number 1 for Bilibili. They just played their style, and it absolutely worked out. That high floor very much coming into play here. Their style very much can take advantage of Weibo's weaknesses. If they can carry that over into the rest of this series, that's massive, but getting that 2-0 lead is going to be ginormous. If you can force Weibo to have to win 3 in a row against Bilibili Gaming, that's a horrible spot for them to end up being in. So game 2 is very important for both teams. Can Weibo even up the series at 1 apiece, or is BLG going to take a dominant 2-0 series lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and this is what domination looks like. Weibo did have some interesting, decisions and moves throughout this game, almost all of them off the back of Tarzan doing his absolute best to try to 1v9 this game on Karthus, but obviously it's not enough. You can't 1v9 Bilibili Gaming. It's just not going to happen regardless of how well Tarzan plays, and BLG ends up coming out on top. Weibo is really kind of crumbling and falling apart. The solo laners in particular have been truly horrendous through the first 2 games of this series, and we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the Weibo Gaming section, but you do have to give credit to Bilibili for kind of forcing those errors to come out of Weibo Gaming. Not all of it is entirely self-inflicted, at least on the top side. In the mid lane, it probably is entirely self-inflicted, but Bilibili's doing a great job of understanding the weaknesses of what Weibo is trying to do and just taking advantage of it, just looking really good in those circumstances. So let's go ahead and go over how they got their player of the game is going to go to Bin. I think you could realistically give this to Wei as well. It probably should go to one of those two individually as players because top lane was a bloodbath for BLG throughout the beginning of this game. They clearly had a goal in mind, and that was to treat Breathe like Dyrus and just dive him over and over and over again. And then Breathe, to his credit, also stepped up and died a ton outside of lane as well. So, it kind of is what it is. Breathe was very happy to donate quite a bit of gold over to BLG, but Bin obliterating that early game, taking some phenomenal trades in what a lot of people consider to be a pretty skillful matchup. On the top side, it just goes to show that Bin is clearly the best top laner in the LPL, right now. Not that Breathe was really in that conversation with how he played in the regular season, but still, just being able to decimate him like this is super impressive, and he definitely earned player of the game. For my money, Ben is the best top laner in the world. I've said that multiple times over the course of this year. It's quite frankly, it's him versus Keen. It's whoever you think is better in terms of those two. I think Ben is a little bit more impressive as a carry, which is why I consider him a little bit better. I thought he was better last year as well, and that definitely plays at least a little bit into my mind in terms of the longevity of it, but you know, at the very least, he's top 2. Like, at the absolute worst, he is one of the top 2 top laners in the world, and he continues to prove that game over game. But Wei deserves a lot of credit for this as well. Some phenomenal pathing. I think Tarzan did a really good job in the early game of understanding where he could and couldn't put a lot of pressure in, and understanding that he had to give over some things in order to gain advantages for himself in other areas. I think that's fine, but unfortunately, that did open up Wei and allow him to kind of do whatever he wanted on the top side of the map, and that was just dive the Gnar over and over again. I think Tarzan assumed that Breathe would generally be fine, that he wouldn't be taking these horrendous trades at the beginning of the game, but you couldn't really rely on that, so Wei ends up actually enabling Ben to really do whatever he wants for a majority of this game, and honestly, Wei's pathing was genuinely phenomenal. Again, he continues to be a massive plus for this team. Not that Shun was bad, just that Wei is a completely different style of player, and generally speaking, I think it helps BLG really unlock the mechanical talent of a lot of their players more than Shun was able to do by getting those like ridiculous early leads on himself. Elkanon continue to be a big positive on the Ziggs and the, you know, engaged threat in the bot lane, whoever it ends up being, the Rel in game 1, the Alistar here in game 2. I think the Ziggs is massive for BLG. It wasn't quite as massive as it was in game number 1. And one thing I do want to touch upon that I didn't actually mention in game 1, I'll probably mention this more the next time BLG ends up playing because I want to get this out to people. But, you know, I'm okay with Elk not being MVP. Like, he was my MVP selection. I'm okay. Like, I certainly think that I'm higher on his performances. I thought he was way too integral to Bilibili to, like, not mention as an MVP frontrunner. But Tion winning, certainly not something that I'm particularly upset about. Him not being on an all-pro team, like, that is disgusting. Like, it is truly, I don't mean to rant about the LPL voting once again, but I continue to think that the LPL voting for awards is the worst of any region, and it's not even remotely close. Like, it is truly disastrous every single year, and every single year they get proven wrong, and so I don't really know what to say. Like, Elk not being on an all-pro team is legit griefing. Like, I get there were 4 really good AD carries this split, and somebody was going to have to miss the all-pro team, but for it to be Elk is, like, genuinely crazy and absurd. To me, he has clearly been the best AD carry in the world in terms of performances, in terms of what we've seen on the Rift in 2024. To say that he's not an all-pro in the LPL is, like, genuinely disgusting, and I think it's, like, it's such a clear lack of actual analysis, in my opinion. Maybe I'm going too hard on it, but, like, I just think it's ridiculous. I think it's genuinely ludicrous, and then, you know, that's my little rant. I just wanted to get that out of the way because Elk is certainly one of the most disrespected players in the world at the current moment. But he was awesome here. Didn't have to do as much again as in game 1, but still very good. Knight was very good, especially in the late game team fights. Weibo actually put a ton of time and pressure into trying to kill him in a lot of these fights, and he just couldn't die. His positioning was really freaking good. The Ash arrows were never landing. Knight's really good. But Ben and Wei were definitely the stars of this game. The top side continues to be something to monitor for BLG. And then for Weibo on the other side, again, their solo laners are just crumbling. Like, there is nothing else to say. Breathe got obliterated by taking some horrible trades in the top lane. He's the easy choice for dud of the game. Not only was he targeted a ton early, but it's not like he did anything in the later half of the game. He was taking some desperation engages on the Gnar and just ended up looking really tilted. I don't know if he actually was tilted, but he certainly looked like he was, and that was not good for Weibo Gaming. You know, Xiaohu continues to just be truly horrendous. I think he was worse in the back half of the game, but Breathe was way too bad at the beginning of the game to not give him dud of the game, and so whether you want to give this to Breathe for just getting obliterated in lane, or whether you want to give it to Xiaohu for just dying randomly at multiple different angles in the back half of the game, both of them have earned it, and both of them have been playing genuinely terrible in this series. But to poor Tarzan, man, he played so well in this game, especially when you go and watch like the early game tape. If you're looking at everything pre-15 minutes, it's kind of hard to play Karthus when your team is getting obliterated and you're trying to do things in the early game. There really isn't just a lot that you can do, but his positioning was basically perfect. His team fighting was unbelievable. He was pulling back kills in team fights purely just based off of how well he was playing. It's not even the Requiem stuff, just positioning. in terms of setting things up for the rest of the team. Really big stuff from Tarzan. Again, if he had had any team around him, perhaps this becomes a game, but he didn't, and so that just ends up happening. Light and Crisp continue to just be there in the bot lane, not really doing anything positive, not really doing anything negative. They're not the problems here. Light wasn't really landing any arrows, but at the end of the day, I would rather take what Light was giving us than what Breathe and Xiaohu were giving us, because they were truly horrendous. And so for Weibo, they've just got to clean this up. If the solo laners are this bad, it's going to be a clean sweep. There's literally no way to win when Breathe and Xiaohu play like this. But for Bilibili, if you can continue to force these errors onto Weibo Gaming, this is going to be a super simple problem for you to solve. So we'll see what happens in Game 3. Can Weibo keep this series alive, or is BLG going to sweep them down into the lower bracket? Well, the winner of Game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take Game number 3. They're going to clean sweep this series 3-0. And Weibo Gaming is going to be moving down to the lower part of the bracket. Bilibili, with this win, moves on now to winners finals. That is a pretty nice place to be. It puts them in a great spot, having already, of course, led in championship points coming into the split. It means that, you know, if they win that winners finals, they're guaranteed a spot at Worlds no matter what. There is no way for them to screw it up at that point. They either win the league and go as the number 1 seed, or they lose the finals and go as the number 2 seed. It's guaranteed as long as they win their next series. So this is a big win for Bilibili, and it's not entirely surprising, but this Game 3 was very fun. This was super bloody, as you can see from the kill score, but a lot of this was in the early game. There was a lot of action early on, and it never really slowed down. I mean, you can see that it was a 26-minute game with like 50 kills. This is a super bloody game from both of these teams, but you got to give a lot of credit to BLG. I think one of our big concerns, at least one of my big concerns going into this tournament, was that they had shown in the regular season that they weren't exactly super keen on trying to skirmish and play super aggressive early. That was something that they wanted to kind of move away from with the introduction of Wei into the team, but as we saw here, that fear of, oh, is this just going to be like a high floor, low ceiling kind of signing for BLG? Is Wei going to come in and kind of decrease their ability to play super fast in the early game? That was absolutely not the case in this game, and I think this game in particular assuaged a lot of my fears when it came to what BLG could be with Wei, because Wei has been such an up and down player over the last like 3 years, essentially. Again, I want to reiterate for people who maybe haven't watched a ton of my other content, I'm a little bit lower on Wei and what he has been for RNG, not only in terms of obviously this year, because this year is a disaster. Everybody was bad for RNG this year. I'm not blaming him entirely for what's happened in 2024, but I don't think he was particularly good last year, and I don't even really think he was that good in 2022 when things were actually going good for RNG. And so, you know, Wei was certainly someone I had my eye on as a bit of a surprise pickup for BLG, but it really has worked out, and it does seem like it was just maybe a system fit thing. RNG has certainly made a lot of players that have played in that org worse over the last 3 or 4 years, and so it's nice to see him free of that prison and end up playing really well, but player of the game for me is going to go to Elk in the bot lane. There was really nobody else who could get this. I still continue to sit on this throne, and I will die on this hill. Jhin is one of the best champions in the game at the current moment. I know Reddit and YouTube comments like try to make Jhin out to be this useless champion, but he's incredibly valuable, especially here in like the eastern regions, in the LPL and in the LCK, when people actually know how to play around it. I think a lot of the perception of Jhin comes from the western regions, where Jhin is obviously worse performing. He's a harder to execute champion in terms of like pro play. He's not quite Ezreal or Ashe, who's very straightforward. He does have to be played around in a bit of a different way, but if you get a ton of gold on him, it can really work. And I understand that he's a bit lower damage, quote unquote, than some of the other AD carries, but he's really not. Like, is he that much lower damage than Ezreal? Like, a little bit, but he's got so much utility that it ends up really working out. And so for Elk, if you're able to get him snowballing in the way that they were able to get him snowballing in this game, it makes it super easy to be able to play through him in the late game. On was also excellent for that on the rel, but I want to give a big shout out to the player of the series, and that's going to go to Bin in the top lane. I felt like he was the most valuable player for BLG. I considered Wei, I considered Elk, hell, even Knight was in the conversation for me. I think you could realistically give it to basically anyone on BLG. This was a real big team effort from the team, but Bin was the one who I thought dominated the most. Some of those Kennen ultimates were pretty suspect, but the good ones were incredibly good and quite frankly game-winning for BLG. And so really want to shout out Bin for a lot of the setup. Wei's pathing was phenomenal. He was the other player that I was like really considering for player of the series. I think Wei more than earned it with his gameplay. Again, I think basically everybody on BLG earned it. It's really just up to personal preference at that point. But congrats to this team. You know, Knight gets 10 kills. He looks great. Everybody looked good in this super bloody game number 3. And I think the most encouraging part is that they were able to play this like really aggressive skirmish heavy style and still actually have it work out for them. So really happy to be proven wrong on that front. And then for Weibo on the other side, it's not entirely surprising to see you lose this series. I think you probably wanted it to be at least slightly more competitive than maybe what it was in this one, but at the end of the day, you just got to live with this result. Crisp is going to get dud of the game here on the Alistair, gets picked at level 1 in the top lane for basically no reason. Does turn around a pretty nice 2v2 in the bot lane, but that's really what helps Elk start to snowball because he just completely outplays Light in that circumstance, and then all of a sudden now the Alistair is entirely useless. It felt like he was looking for some hero engages at the end of the game where the team was just not ready to follow up on it, and oftentimes he was just caught out and died for basically no gain, basically nothing at the end of the game. So Crisp is going to get dud of the game, but really this goes to basically everyone. Somehow, some way, I think this was the best game Xiaohu played across this entire series. He was actually doing damage on the Tristana. He looked a lot more comfortable off of the Zeri, which is funny because I thought he looked really good on the Zeri against Ninjas in Pajamas, but Light got completely outplayed in multiple exchanges by Elk. Breathe was just horrible throughout this entire series. I want to touch on something very quickly. Again, this won't be a surprise to anybody who's watched the channel, but all of the bring back the shy comments, you know, I understand it because Breathe was kind of rough in this series, and obviously if you are kind of a very casual viewer of the LPL, I understand why, like, bring back the shy comments would ring through your head when you watch Weibo Gaming lose to a team like BLG and top lane be such a problem, but I want to make it clear where my stance is on this. There is a 0% chance that the Shy and Tarzan can play on the same team. Like, there is no way that is even remotely possible. And I know that feels like an over exaggeration, but their styles could not be more opposite, and Tarzan is way too integral to what Weibo is doing right now. If you just plugged the Shy into this team, they would get significantly worse because the Shy would just do all of the bad parts of the Shy, and, you know, that's even assuming that he locks in for the actual regional playoffs, which is not something he's done, particularly over the past couple of years, but if you put the Shy and Tarzan on the same team, they go 12th in the LPL. Like, I truly believe that it's just a disaster. That's my personal opinion. I think playstyle-wise, there's just absolutely no way to make that work. And so, as bad as Breathe was here, I understand why he was definitely the choice for them, or at the very least was the one they ended up going with. And then, you know, like I said, Light definitely outplayed. And so overall, like, Weibo, they just didn't have the firepower to stand up to Bilibili. This was never going to be that close of a series, and BLG ended up making that abundantly clear. So, really nice win for them. They move on to winners finals, and Weibo is going to look to try to get their revenge down in lowers. But then moving on to our second round 4 series, and this one was significantly more interesting to me on paper. These are two very different teams in terms of how they approach the game, but also two very talented teams that have both gone through some ups and downs over the course of this year. It's the number 2 seeded LNG Esports taking on the number 3 seeded Top Esports. Of course, TES getting here by beating anyone's legend in the previous round, solidifying the spots in the regional qualifier, knocking AL out of 2024. TES looks great at the current moment. I mean, there's really no other way to look at it. Losing that game against AL in game number 2 broke their undefeated streak that had been lasting about a month, and really there's no reason to believe that they aren't going to be pretty big favorites coming into a series like this. I think that they have kind of proven that they, at the very least, deserve to be considered one of the best teams in the world. They go to the finals of the Esports World Cup, and that tournament ends up screwing them over in terms of the LPL. They have to come back and play in the LPL like 3 days after that, and they end up obviously losing their first 2 series, one of them against LNG, the other against Bilibili Gaming, the top 2 seeds. They had to play them right back out of the Esports World Cup break. It certainly wasn't ideal for them, but they end up recovering, they end up getting back onto the right page, and they come out for the rest of the regular season and go undefeated, not only in terms of series, but in terms of games. They didn't drop a single game after that first week back in the LPL. It's been incredibly impressive. I think, you know, a lot of the players have gotten a lot of credit that they've deserved. I mean, Tian got the MVP award. He definitely has earned that. I think this is one of, if not his most consistent split of his entire career. He has been phenomenal for Top Esports, and this guy's a former World Finals MVP, so that's pretty good. I think that, you know, you look at Cream, the development that he's made over the course of this year, he's maybe become the most consistent mid laner in the entire region. Jackie Love and Mako have certainly been fighting to be considered the best bot lane in the LPL over the course of this split. Really, the only concern has been that you haven't gotten like the 3-6-9 that you thought you were getting, that you got in the spring split. He's kind of just been a guy on this team. He's rolled, you know, a lot of 3s over the course of this split, mostly 6s, and then basically no 9s over the course of the summer split, but it's 3-6-9. You expect him to be able to step up in the playoffs, and he was was really good in that series against AL. He really was able to take advantage of Ale when he was off of his comfort picks. And so you feel very good about Top Esports, and then they're going into LNG, who's kind of a big question mark. And I know that feels weird to say as the number 2 seed coming in here, but a lot of people are considering them frauds, quote unquote. Obviously, I've pushed back on that narrative pretty heavily. I think this is a very good League of Legends team that is probably not getting the credit that they deserve, but this is going to be a really tough series to prove that in, because Top Esports is incredibly good and probably is the second best team. And so LNG certainly not coming in as favorites, but there are a lot of good things going for them. I think they've really landed on a playing style. And as I've talked about for a majority of the year, that was the most important thing for them. The problem, in my opinion, for them throughout a majority of spring and then at the beginning of the summer split is just them not being able to figure out where they wanted to put their resources, how they wanted to enable the best players on their team. Weibo and Scout in particular just could not seem to get on the same page. Kind of similar to what we talked about when it came to Weibo Gaming, where, you know, they had the talent, they just needed to figure out how to get it out of their players. And ultimately, it ended up being Weibo that had to compromise. No more early game skirmishing. We're going to play fully for scaling, and we're going to play for Scout trying to 5v5 in a lot of these games, and that ended up really working out for LNG. Scout started popping off. He really was one of the best, if not the best mid laner in the region over the second half of the split, even if he was pretty rough at the beginning of the split. Gala and Hung have really adopted that weak side bot lane role, maybe better than anyone. Gala is one of the best weak side bot laners in the entire world. Zika, I think, has been significantly stronger in the second half. He's genuinely been one of the best top laners in the LPL ever since the start of Group Ascend, and Weibo, while he's not, you know, flashy, he's not the star of this team by any means. I think just him filing into a role, taking a more decreased role on the team overall has definitely helped LNG in general. And so you're looking at a team that has gotten better, that has found how they wanted to play, and now they're going to be put to the test. Like, this is the biggest test that they've had over the course of this year. Top Esports is one of the strongest teams in the world, and you know, if LNG can overcome this, if they can even be competitive in this, then obviously that's going to prove that they are not frauds. But we'll have to see how it ends up going. And of course, going game by game means we get to start with game 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Top Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was a pretty fun back and forth game. This was actually pretty close. Not sure how well that comes across just based on the stats on the screen, but LNG held a lead for basically the entirety of this early game and really going through the mid game as well. They only lost it once a horrible Baron play ends up going completely awry for them. Top Esports ends up picking up, I think, 4 kills, and the Baron in the game just snowballs completely out of control. There's really no way for LNG to be able to get back into it at that point. It just goes to show the clinicalness of Top Esports in terms of these 5v5s. They're very good in that area of the game, but LNG certainly putting up a fight, and generally speaking, what we've seen, at least as a trend throughout the playoffs, is that the team that wins early is often going to be more consistent throughout a series. And so if LNG can keep capitalizing on their very good early game like they had here, then perhaps we can look at something changing in the future. But quite a slow early game. I think that definitely is something that favored LNG. The moment that things started to pick up in terms of action, that's when Top Esports really started to take over. Player of the game for me is actually going to go to 369 on the top side. This Mordekaiser is just so effective, and quite frankly, he won them that Baron fight that ended up completely turning around the game. He ults Weibo out of the Baron pit. There's absolutely nothing he can do. He literally has to flash over the Baron pit wall. Now the jungler's not there. Now it's basically a free fight. Cream wasn't even there. He didn't have teleport. He couldn't get to the fight early. They needed some sort of miracle way to make this some sort of an even fight, and that's exactly what they got, because Mordekaiser just does so much as a champion. And so the R5 Mord really paying off. 369, I think, coming in really clutch there. The ultimates in general I thought were very valuable, and generally his laning was also pretty good. Again, maybe you want to give it to somebody who was a little bit better throughout the entirety of the game, but 369 made the game-winning play, which to me is good enough to give him player of the game. Also want to shout out Tion. I mean, this guy is just ridiculous. He's the best Ivern in the world. I think we're at the point where it's very clear that he just understands the limits and the positives of this champion better than basically anybody else in professional League of Legends at the moment. And it's funny to say that coming out of the LPL, which was a region that was getting criticized and laughed at for not being able to play Ivern this year. And so for Tion to be able to pick up the champion and realize, like, oh wow, I actually really love this, I'm going to play it every single game, it's just kind of funny. He's very good at being able to understand when he can and can't engage, when he needs to play aggressive and exactly how aggressive he can be while still getting out alive. It's very fun, very impressive to see. Mako was great this game on the Alistair. Thought he had a phenomenal engage in the back half of this game that really set up the final team fight. Cream, Jackie Love, they didn't really make any mistakes. They were good. Jackie Love in particular, I thought had a couple of great moments here, but this was kind of a team effort from Top Esports. Again, a bit of a slow early game. I don't think that necessarily favors them, and I think we saw that, but they were good enough to be able to pull back that lead after being down a little bit going into the late game. And then for LNG, again, if you just held on to some of that gold lead that you were able to get, then perhaps you have something here. Unfortunately, you just don't really have a lot of damage on this team once Scout starts to lose in the mid lane matchup, and so you're looking at these 5v5s and you're really just hoping that Gala can actually just 1v9, and it's going to be really hard to do that on a champion like Jhin. Weiwei was never really in a great spot. Zika was pretty solid this game, but not really a ton he can do on the Cassante, and ends up just kind of falling away. I think obviously people are going to point to that one team fight, but there were multiple situations throughout the game where I think LNG was happy trading objectives when they probably should have been better off just trying to force the lead open a little bit more, maybe being a bit more aggressive, which is something that this team has not really been all that willing to do over the past couple of weeks, and we're seeing that be taken advantage of here. Hong is going to get my dud of the game on the Nautilus. Not really a horrible game from him, but he was the sacrificial lamb in a lot of circumstances, and that really ended up giving a lot of gold over to Top Esports. I think the other player that obviously you can realistically give this to is Scout in the mid lane. This felt like a, Group B matchup. I think that they were Group B. They could have been Group C. You guys will let me know down in the comments, but LNG and Top Esports were, of course, in the same group in the qualification stage of the summer split, and Top Esports was able to win both of their series by taking advantage of Scout and not really letting him get ahead, understanding how they need to shut him down. It very much felt like that all over again, and so we'll see if that ends up continuing to be a problem, but at least for now, LNG seems to be a bit exposed and a bit understood by Top Esports. They clearly have done their homework. They know exactly what they should be targeting, and game number one felt very good, but very good in favor of Top. But there are some things to like from LNG's performance. They just couldn't quite hold on. If they can get that early game lead again, you have to imagine that they're going to be a bit more clinical in terms of closing that out. But for Top Esports, you want to get that 2-0, you want to get that series lead, you want to establish your dominance, and you want to match Bilibili, because they're really your rivals at this point. So we'll see if they can do that, or if LNG is going to even up the series at 1 apiece. The winner of game number 2 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they have really taken full control of this round number 4 matchup against LNG, and it's crazy because this was honestly a pretty similar story to game number 1, where LNG is able to get this pretty solid lead, like not dominant, but a good lead, like a 2k gold lead going into 15-20 minutes into the game, and then it just takes one bad fight, and all of a sudden the entire game is gone. Everything is out of their hands at that point. It's very weird how this ends up happening. Typically speaking, like I said, in the LPL so far in the playoffs, it's been mostly about who can generate the biggest early game lead as to who's going to win these games, who's going to win these series. But in this one, it's completely been flipped on its head. LNG has had pretty solid early games. They're constantly able to get 3k gold leads, and they're just not able to hold on to them. For Top Esports, to their credit, they're great at being able to take these fights under circumstances that wouldn't normally be advantageous for them and turning it into something that is very easily winnable for them. And I think you have to give basically everybody on the team a lot of credit for that. I want to shout out the bot lane. I think the bot lane was exceptional in this game in terms of setting up and following through. Player of the game is hard, man, because it really is like a team effort for Top Esports. I think Broadcast gave it to 369. This game was good. It was really good from the Mordekaiser, but do I think it was more important than game number 1? Maybe not, and that's why I gave it to Jackie Love personally. But if you want to give it to 369, if you want to give it to Mako on the Leona, who I thought was excellent in this game, you can do that. But Jackie Love was the one who came in clutch in that final fight, ended up really cleaning things up, and his Ezreal mechanics are just elite. We've seen it throughout basically the entire season, but specifically in these 2 playoff series up until this point, his Ezreal is just untouchable in terms of the utility and damage that it offers in the back half of the game. We really see the difference between the best AD carries in the world when they start to play Ezreal. That's why it's always fun when he is in the meta. I want to shout out Tian, who goes to the Diana, gets his Ivern taken away, and he's like, screw it, I'm the carry now. Didn't really do all that much in this game. The Diana wasn't particularly impactful. It didn't really need to be. He was on the map. Like, I'm not trying to say he wasn't involved in a lot of the plays. He absolutely was. He just wasn't the one that was driving it home. It wasn't this big Diana pop-off game where Tian absolutely dominates. It was just a very well-played game from Tian, and Weiwei had some horrible macro mistakes throughout this entire game that Tian did a very good job of taking advantage of. Cream was good on the Corki, but generally 369, Jackie Love, Mako, definitely the standouts for me here in game number 2. And then for LNG on the other side, Gala tried his best. He was actually in a really good spot here, ends up getting quite a bit of gold in a couple of these fights. The Xayah was in a good situation. The problem was that topside was just not going the way of LNG. Zika's going to get my dud of the game here for game number 2. The Cassante was just not relevant. Some of the teleports were good, and he actually did a good job trying to pull pieces apart, but it was too little too late. He was part of the reason that Top Esports was actually able to get their gold lead back in this game, was his bad positioning in some of these pretty crucial fights, and so definitely have to give him dud of the game for that. Weiwei also deserves a lot of blame for this. You know, his mechanics have always been really good, but the problem for Weiwei individually as a player has always been that his macro is super questionable in the mid to late game. He makes very weird decisions, and that is carried over here to LNG. He's just not a very good late game player. He's not really that great of a team fighter either, and so you find this situation where Weiwei is kind of an important piece in this front to back comp once the Xayah is really the only threat in terms of the damage, and he's just not really able to live up to that. His team fighting is just not particularly good as a player. He's a great early game jungler, not a great late game jungler, and unfortunately he's been asked to jump into that late game role, and I think it's really hurt his individual performances. Scout is really just not doing anything. He's not had a particularly good series at all. He's essentially been useless on this Lucian. Like I said, Gala, Hong, they were trying to do some things on the Xayah Rakan down in the bot lane, but there just weren't enough resources to go around to actually be able to make that work. LNG, now sitting at 0-2 after having 2 early game leads, has to feel pretty bad about this situation as a whole. I'm sure they have the firepower to get back into this. They are good enough as a team to be able to get back into this, but we have to see it now. They have to win 3 in a row in order to move on in this series. I think at this point they will take a game win in order to raise their confidence going down into the lower bracket, but Top Esports has the chance to close this out in a clean 3-0 sweep. Are they going to be able to do it, or is LNG going to at the very least stay alive for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to close out this series with another 3-0 sweep, and we've got a date with Destiny in the winners finals. It's Bilibili Gaming Top Esports. I'm excited to preview that at the end of the video, but let's talk about game number 3. This was kind of similar to the trend that we've seen throughout this series. It was, once again, a pretty slow open, which I do think should theoretically favor LNG in a series like this. They are the team that's a little bit more comfortable going to these late game fights, or at least that's what they've shown over the course of this year, but that was just not the case in this series. All 3 games really came down to 5v5 team fights that Top Esports was just straight up better in, so that's kind of a disaster, I would say, all things considered, for LNG. Your main win condition was exploited by a team that is just better than you in the early game as well, and so there really was not a lot to like about that for LNG, but at the very least they were able to stay competitive, and I think for Top Esports, the fact that they could show that they could win these slower paced games, that they don't need to push the tempo and really dominate in that way, I think is a good thing overall. I think when you're talking about player of the game, this one's pretty simple in game number 3, and it's actually going to be both my player of the game and my player of the series. It's going to go to Tian in the jungle. I just thought he was the most consistent when you look at, obviously, the Ivern game in game 1, and then the Lilia here in game 2. He was the standout member for Top Esports, in my opinion. I think I considered 369 really heavily for this. I considered Mako pretty heavily for this. It should be one of those 3, in my opinion. I think they were the 3 that stood out, at least to me, the most throughout this series, but again, very similar to what we talked about with BLG. When you beat a good team like LNG is, when you're able to come back from a lot of these deficits, it's typically not one player just dominating and running through their opponent. It's oftentimes a team effort, and especially in a sweep like this, you got to give all of Top Esports a lot of credit. But Tian kind of earning that MVP status here. I was pretty frustrated with his MVP pick in 2022, I believe it was, when he won MVP in the summer split overnight. I remember, kind of going on a campaign being like, Tian's overrated, the MVP was, stolen from his teammate Ignite, who was really doing a lot of the heavy lifting from the team, and obviously, that has aged, I would say, pretty well, especially going back and watching those games. It's crazy that Tian was getting the credit for what Knight was doing, but I'm pretty on board with Tian right now. He was second in MVP voting for me, and so I'm really not frustrated with him winning. I think he has clearly been the best jungler in the LPL, and he continues to really push this team forward. He's the driving force for Top Esports, who has been maybe the hottest team in the LPL over the past month. And then, like I said, the rest of the team was great. 369, not quite as, show-offy on the Poppy as he was on the Mordekaiser. Still a pretty good game, all things considered. His lane opponent was kind of a disaster in this one, but the Poppy didn't really do all that much on R5. Jackie Love and Mako were great here. Mako, in particular, has just been awesome throughout this entire series. There is a really strong argument that he is just the best support in the world, and honestly, I'm kind of making that. I, right now, think that Mako is the best support in the world in terms of what we've seen so far over the course of 2024. This is a perfect meta for a Jackie jack-of-all trades type of support like Mako is. He's good in lane, he's good out of lane, he's good in team fights, he can roam, he can play the mid game. He's just really good at every part of the support position, and he continues to really shine. But Jackie Love is awesome on Ezreal, even if he didn't really have to do all that much this game. Cream was solid in this series. Scout was actually able to get a lead in this one, mostly through macro plays, and so Cream had to play on the back foot for probably the first time in this entire series, but still was very relevant on the Corki. But this was Tion kind of carrying Top Esports through this third and final game, and it was really the team as a whole that was really kind of dominant. And so excited to see them moving on. And for LNG, obviously kind of a disappointing way to go out. I think not winning a single game, especially after kind of getting an early game lead in all three, is certainly a bit disappointing, but I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. Top Esports is very good. You were the underdogs coming into this series, I think, for a lot of people, and this game at the very least had some, interesting moments in terms of how they played the game in previous splits or in previous series. This split, Scout actually got quite a bit of gold on his Yone. This has been kind of the go-to champion for LNG over the course of this split. And Scout got off to a pretty strong start, 2-0 on the Yone, and was able to actually move around the map and try to fight, but nobody else in this team was able to do basically anything. Weiwei was missing Sejuani ultimates left and right. Gala and Hong were essentially useless down in the bot lane after not being all that relevant in the early 2v2, and Zika is going to get my dud of the game here. Just not a good game number 3, not really a good series at all from him. He's been hit or miss. He's definitely one of the more, up and down upper tier top laners at this level, I would say. Obviously, I wouldn't consider him an inconsistent player in comparison to maybe someone like the Shy, who's very, feast or famine. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's his style, but Zika can be exploited by players who are a little bit more consistent. And we definitely saw that here. 369 had a great series. Tion put a lot of pressure onto that top side. It honestly was kind of similar to our first series with Bilibili and Weibo, where a lot of pressure was put onto the top side and they were just trying to scale that out of control. Kind of was similar here for Top Esports, but definitely a bit of a top gap. And like I said, Weiwei was not very good in this series. I think Scout wasn't very good in the back half here of game number 3 when he was so integral and so important for the team, constantly getting caught out. Overall, LNG just they weren't good enough to be able to compete with Top Esports. Their strategy was not working. They got outplayed in their area of the game, and it's just a very disappointing thing to be able to see. Hopefully they can bounce back. They definitely have an easier opponent now in lower bracket in Weibo Gaming, who I think they should be better than, but you never really know. That jungle matchup I think is actually very in favor of Weibo, so we'll talk about that in the preview. But for Top Esports, this is one of the best teams in the world. I think people continue to underestimate them. I said in my playoff primer video that if Top Esports ends up winning the LPL, I'm going to be the least surprised person on the planet. This team absolutely has a very good case to be made that right now they are the hottest and strongest team in the LPL, and they're going to get their chance to prove it now in Winners Finals. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Summer Playoffs Round 4 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen, the updated bracket after the upper bracket here for round number 4. We still have some round 4 matchups to go over. One round 4 matchup to go over, but we can go ahead and preview those now. They're going to be the next video here. We, of course, have the Winners Finals, Bilibili taking on Top Esports. Very intrigued by this. These are the two best teams in the LPL, I think pretty unquestionably, especially after those round 4 series. I hope that this is a close series. I hope it's not a blowout. BLG are going to be favorites. Bilibili are going to be favorites going into a series like this, but Top Esports can beat anybody. They've shown that, and especially with the form that they're in right now, they've already conquered one of their demons from the regular season. We'll see if they can conquer another. I think BLG are slight favorites, but man, if Top Esports win this, again, I'm going to be the least surprised person on the planet. They absolutely have a real shot of just being the best team in the LPL. And then Weibo versus LNG. Reddit will call this a fraud off down in the lower bracket. It's funny that the fraud off means that it's 2 of the top 4 teams in the LPL. Funny how the word fraud is thrown around in the LPL vocabulary. Of course, Reddit loves to use that word in general, but this is an interesting series. I think it's really going to be up to which carry can actually effectively perform better. It's going to be Scout versus Tarzan. It's funny, the 2 former teammates kind of going head to head. Weiwei versus Tarzan. Of course, these 2 players swapping teams from last year, with Weiwei being on Weibo last year, Tarzan, of course, being on LNG last year. It's going to be interesting to see who can get the upper hand. I think Tarzan has been infinitely better as a jungler over the course of this year, at least individually. I don't think Weiwei has been good really at all. He's been a pretty big problem for LNG, and Tarzan has been really a big stabilizing presence and a strength for Weibo Gaming, the strength for Weibo. But it's going to be up to whether or not Scout gets ahead. If Scout can start fighting a little bit more consistently 5v5, and if he can actually generate a lot of these resources and be a primary carry, then LNG should be able to win the series. But if that doesn't happen, Weibo is just the better team when you're not taking Scout into the equation. I think Gala and Hong are very solid and they're very good as a bot lane, but they've not really shown that they want to be the #1 option on this team, and this team has clearly not shown a lot of interest in playing through them as a bot lane, and so we'll have to see how that ends up going. Weibo might actually be favorites for me when it comes to that series, if only because of the matchup, but let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Would love to know your thoughts and opinions there. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LPL, we post about all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL, and playoffs are, rocking and rolling in basically every region now. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, especially with Worlds coming up, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.